Well, we wanted to give you a scary intro before we started this so that you guys could be on alert. Because everybody's scared of something, right? I mean, we all have a fear of something. There's some people who are scared of 8 o'clock in the morning. That's why there's only so few that are here. 9:15 is when they really start braving the day. But you guys are well awake way before 8 a.m. But we're all scared of something. Forgive me now if any of these are your actual fears. I apologize for making light of them ahead of time. Dinophobia, the fear of dinner parties. Okay? So like how we bring our pets inside for 4th of July because they're scared of all the fireworks, these type of people are like indoors under blankets when it's Thanksgiving time. They're absolutely petrified of dinner parties. Or selenophobia, the fear of the moon. So you think back to the eclipse that we have, they're like, oh good, it's gone. And then they see it again and like, no, it's a blood moon. The world's gonna end. So some people have an absolute fear for the moon. Genophobia, the fear of knees. There's a lady that's in the UK that actually has this fear. She is scared to death of knees. It's ruined her friendships because friends have accidentally touched her knees, and she can never go to a swimming pool ever again. So Newport Beach, to these people, is like a zombie apocalypse. All right? Their worst nightmare is like a giant kneecap eating them alive. A game for Christmas, you would never want to buy them hungry kneecaps because that would be a terrible gift to give them at Christmas time. The fear of Dutch people, Dutch phobia, fear of Dutch people and culture. Now, most people didn't even know that they had this type of fear that existed in the world. Some people didn't even know that we actually had Dutch people in the world. But people do have a fear of Dutch people and their culture, or palatophobia, the fear of bald people. Now, these people wouldn't last a hot second in our nursery. They would be running out of our nursery, fearing their lives, and then they would try to find shelter in the sanctuary, and they would catch hold of Mitch and I, and they would tear out of this church in no time because they were scared to death of bald people. Now, all of us are scared of something. One of the fears that I've had growing up, and I still have dealt with it even as an adult, is the fear of failure, not wanting to fail at something. And there's many people who have the fear of failure. I've had those dreams before where I'm on stage, I'm scheduled to speak, and I realize that I don't have any notes, and I've had that dream on numerous occasions of having that fear of failing at that opportunity of speaking or whatever it might be that you're scheduled to do. But many people struggle with the fear of failure. And failure has a way of really freezing you in place. And it has a way of freezing you in place because really its roots, the fear of failure's roots, are down into the soil of this idea that we have to be 100% successful at everything we do. And part of that fear of failure is that I don't want to miss this opportunity. I don't want to fail at this. It's the hidden belief that whatever we do, we have to be 100% successful at it. Now, many people have struggled with the fear of failure, and it keeps them from attempting certain things. However, there are some people who have no fear of failure at all. But we would be scared, and that's why we might not attempt some things. For instance, some people have tried to do Pinterest things. Up there you have the Cookie Monster cupcakes. Down there you have the people who nailed it. Next we have a wonderful lamb cake, and then we have that. That scares me. Now this is a very cool creation, but look what happens when some attempt it. That doesn't look like the picture, Mom. Now those are some of the favorite Girl Scout cookies, right? The Samoa cookies, they're absolute favorites. People love those. Look what happens when we attempt it. Doesn't look the same. Probably tastes the same, but doesn't look the same. And so people do struggle with the attempt of doing something and believing that they're going to fail from it. And they failed at times in their life, and so there's a great fear of failure that they have. And I've struggled with that in my own life. Now, at one point, we come to realize with this fear of failure is that there's no way we'll be 100% successful in life, whether it's in our marriages, in our work, in our faith. You know, wherever you're at being a parent, you're not going to be 100% successful, and you're going to fail. And you and I have had great failures, and we're going to continue to have failure be a part of our life from time to time. But the thing is, looking at failure and always having a negative view of it may not be the best thing. In fact, there have been some great people, authors and leaders in our world, musicians, celebrities, thinkers, teachers, great people who have talked about failure in a positive way. For instance, Theodore Roosevelt said this: "Far better is to dare mighty things to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy nor suffer much because they live in the great twilight that knows not victory nor defeat." So even the great Theodore Roosevelt looked at failure and said, failure can be a great thing. It's part of our life, and we can have some positive outcomes from it. Another great author, or a great author for that matter, J.K. Rowling, says this: "It's impossible to live without failing at something, unless you live so cautiously that you might as well not live at all, in which case you have failed by default." And so failure is considered by many people a terrible thing, and nobody wants to fail. But there can be some wonderful positive things that come out of failure. Now, you can't go through the Gospels at all without noticing Peter the disciple. He's all over the Gospels. And one of the things that I've noticed about reading about Peter in the Gospels is that he has many, many failures that he experiences. You go throughout the whole Bible, even though when you go to the book of Hebrews chapter 11, and they have that chapter that many people call the Great Hall of Faith, every single one of those people that are mentioned there, more than likely you will find other pages about them that talk about their failures. Doesn't just talk about their successes. And Peter is definitely one of the disciples that really jumps off the pages of the Gospels in Jesus' life, and you see a lot of failure from him. You see many times that he has failed. In fact, one of the things that we see first with Peter that he fails at, and many of you may have a way to relate with him, I know I do, is he failed in his faith. Some of us have failed at times in our faith. Peter failed in his faith for sure. Matthew chapter 14, verses 28 to 31. Just to set this up for you, this has been a very long day. The disciples have had a very long day with Jesus and doing ministry, and they get into a boat because they're escaping the crowds, and they're going to go across the Sea of Galilee. And as they're going across the Sea of Galilee, it's late at night. Jesus decided to stay behind and have time with prayer with God. And late in the night, Jesus goes out walking on the water. He can see the disciples in the boat. They are struggling in the boat, trying to row and get across the lake to go to the other side. And Jesus is walking on the water, and this is where the scene picks up, Matthew 14, 28 to 31. That's printed there in your notes. It says, "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. And then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand, caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" Now, you notice there, Jesus says, at the end, it says, "Why did you doubt?" What's amazing is that in the beginning, Peter didn't doubt. I know that the NIV translation, the notes that we printed for you, says, "if it's you." But actually, and I don't know why the NIV chooses to translate the word "if" there. Instead, you could actually translate it "since." And so Peter doesn't begin this moment with, "hey, if it's you," with doubt. He begins the moment and says, "Since it's you, Jesus, out there, tell me to come out to you." So he has great faith in the beginning. "Since it's you on the water, tell me to come out to you." And haven't you had those moments before where you really believe Since it's you, Jesus, I'm asking you to help me. Since it's you, Jesus, I'm asking for the courage to stand for you at my job. Since it's you, Jesus, I'm asking you for the courage to be a better father. Since it's you, Jesus, I'm trusting you by giving to you, giving you my tithe. I'm going to trust that you're going to take care of my needs since it's you. And then you have that moment, like many of us have had, like Peter here, where we lose our footing on the water and we begin to sink. And we begin to, as the great hymn, the great old hymn, "Come thou fount of every blessing." I love the lines in that hymn. It says, "Let thy grace now like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee," just like Peter's heart had wandered. "Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love." And many of us have felt at faith like that. Our hearts have wandered. And what's truly amazing about this story is how Peter's heart began to wander and he began to sink in the water. And you know what Jesus did? Jesus didn't come up to him as he's there flapping around in the water and the wind's blowing. He didn't say, "Now swim back to the boat." He reached his hand down in his failed faith and he pulled him up. Doesn't say that he, let him hold on to the bottom of his toga as he walked across. It said he reached his hand down, so he grabbed Peter, he pulled him out of the water, and they walked back to the boat together. That's the kind of Savior we have, that even when we fail in our faith, he still rescues us. Not only that, but Peter failed in his understanding of Jesus, who Jesus is and what his mission's about. Have you been there before? In Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 to 23, just before this, Peter has this wonderful shining moment. Isn't that how our life goes in Christianity? We have moments when we are doing wonderful and we are saying, "Lord, I feel your presence." And then we have moments where we say, "Lord, where is your presence?" And God's saying, "Where are you now?" And here Peter, before these verses in Matthew 16, Jesus says, "Who do you say I am? Who do the people say I am?" And they get all these different answers. And then Peter says, and he's the first one to declare this, he says, "You are the Christ. You're the Son of God. You're the Messiah of the world." And Jesus commends him for it. He says, "Simon, son of John, you are Cephas. You are a rock. You are rock solid. And what you declare has not come from your own. That's come from God who has revealed this to you." And he absolutely acknowledges and lets Peter know, "Well done for knowing that." And then Peter has a moment just a few verses later. And in Matthew 16, verses 21 to 23, Jesus begins to talk about what his mission is as the Messiah. He says, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to the disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life." Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said. "This shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." So Peter's moment here looks an awful lot like my progress reports when I was in junior high. On Monday, I was an absolute saint. I was the most perfect child you could ever have in class as a middle schooler. But by the time we got to Friday, my teacher somehow had a long memory of my transgressions all week. And they wrote that down on that progress report. That's how it looks for Peter. In the very beginning here, Peter is doing great. But then you get to this moment, and the text says, Peter pulled Jesus aside. He's taken Jesus, and he's having a side meeting with him away from the rest of the disciples. And you know what Peter's doing? He's not pulling him aside because he has good intentions. He's pulling him aside in order to talk some sense into Jesus. You're the Messiah. How dare you talk like that? How dare you talk like someone's going to arrest you and then they're going to crucify you on that horrible, awful Roman capital punishment? How dare you talk about rising from the dead? And at a few pages before, or a few verses before, Jesus commends Peter, and here he rebukes him. He goes from being a solid rock to being a stumbling block. Why? Because he misunderstood Jesus. How often have we misunderstood Jesus and his mission and purpose for our life? That some have probably thought, Jesus is going to make every bit of my relationships better. That Jesus is going to completely transform my marriage. That Jesus is going to bless me with the greatest of things. Only to have Jesus say to us, you don't understand. You don't fully understand me or my mission. I love this wonderful quote by Brennan Manning, a Christian author, in his book, The Signature of Jesus. He says, nobody wants to hear about Christ crucified these days. Everybody wants Jesus, the agent of social change, or Christ the revolutionary, or the master of interpersonal relationships, who's going to help them win friends and influence people. But nobody wants to hear about a Christ nailed to the wood, who says, change your life, strike out in a new direction, come follow me, and allow yourself to be radically discipled. That's who Jesus really is. And here Peter shows that he failed even in his understanding of that. Not only in his understanding, but he also failed in his commitment to Jesus. After declaring that he would be 100% sold out and committed to Jesus. Matthew 26, 69 to 75. By this point in the story, Jesus has been arrested. They came to the Garden of Gethsemane, and they arrested Jesus there. The interesting thing is that we think of like just this little swipe that Peter took in the darkness, and it somehow caught that guy's ear off. We don't realize this. Peter actually missed. When he went to go with the knife, he was going to kill this person. And he missed, thank goodness, and he just cut his ear off. What we don't realize either, John tells us about this, how John the disciple and Peter, these are the only two who go all the way to the scene where Jesus is having his trial. And there's scholars believe that Peter was actually there, scoping things out, looking for an opportunity to break Jesus out. That he wasn't giving up on Jesus and trying to break him out from this arrest. And here he is in this courtyard as Jesus is indoors being tried in front of these Jewish leaders. And this is where the scene picks up. Verse 69 says, now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. You also were with Jesus of Galilee, she said. But he denied it before them all. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Then he went out to the gateway where another servant girl saw him and said to the people, this fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. He denied it again, and with an oath, I don't know the man. And after a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, surely you're one of them. Your accent gives you away. Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know the man. And immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word of Jesus had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And when he went outside and wept bitterly. Now here you have a contrast between Jesus' trial and Matthew. You have a contrast between Jesus' trial and Peter's. At Jesus' trial, you have Jesus silently not responding to the verbal accusations. And at Peter's trial, you have Peter being very verbal and responding to his accusations. At Jesus' trial, you have false witnesses bringing testimony against Jesus. At Peter's trial, you have 2 servant girls telling the honest truth about this. And then Peter denies Jesus. And he shows that he failed in his commitment of faith. Now, what's awesome about this story is that it should really be encouraging to us. Because maybe you've never ever been there before, kind of where Peter's been, where you're just flat out rejecting Jesus. But this should encourage us because God is in the business of transforming our lives, not condemning our lives. And what we see next with Peter, the great scene, is how God, even in the midst of Peter's failures, restores him. That's what happens, is that God remains faithful even in Peter's failures. John 21, 17 to 19. Before this, you have in John chapter 20, you have the news from the women, Mary Magdalene and the other women who went to the tomb. They said that the body has been missing. Jesus has risen from the dead. John, the disciple, and Peter race out of the home that they're in, and they're running towards the tomb. What's interesting that John mentions, he says, I beat Peter to the tomb in the foot race. But you come to think about it, you think, did Peter lose on purpose? Did he not want to get to the tomb first? Because in his mind, he thought, what will Jesus say to me? Because Jesus knows that I've rejected him. And he told me that I would do that. So now what's he going to say to me? And you have this moving scene at the end of the Gospel of John where Jesus and Peter are around a campfire. And Peter's failures are being put on display. But so is Jesus' forgiveness. And in John 21, verses 17 to 19, it says, the third time, so we have two other times here. This is the third time that Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. And Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. One of the hardest things that Peter had to go through was to have this moment where his failures would be on display and have to acknowledge those things before the Lord. Haven't we been there before? Where we go to God with our raw heart, that tender heart, where those failures have come back and they feel like they're piercing our heart all over again. And we lay them down there before God and before Christ and the cross. And here Peter does that, and what he comes to realize and experience is that God remains faithful, even in spite of our failures. And if Peter could be forgiven of his failure of rejecting Jesus in the greatest time of Jesus' life of being arrested and crucified, how much more can the Lord forgive us? And it's great encouragement to look at failures in life and not let them freeze you, but how God can take those failures and he can give us victory. He can redeem us out of that. And that's what we see here with Peter's life. Because Jesus is in the business of transforming our failures. Now, how can that happen? How could we see that in our life as we journey through life in faith? How could we see from time to time how Jesus can transform our failures? Where we can go from this crumbling, stumbling block to this solid rock. Where Peter goes from being this one who crumbled under the pressure and denied Jesus to being this rock who stood on Pentecost and the church got started that day through the Holy Spirit. How can we see Jesus transform our own failures in life? Well, the first thing is this: I can learn from them. I can learn from my failures. Now, what do we mean we can learn from them? The most important thing that we can learn, and we'll see how this plays out even later in the message, but the most important thing that we can learn from our failures is perspective about ourselves before God. What do I mean by that? Well, at one time in 2004, the late 2004, about July 26, I had moved to the Bay Area to start a new church. And I was partnering with an organization that started churches all over the United States. And so I was partnering with them. I was one of the youngest people ever to partner with them in order to start a church. And so I was moving to the Bay Area. Bethany and McKenna. McKenna was 3 months old. They ended up coming out about a month later. And so we began doing work there in order to start a new church. And in 2005, in March, we had our very first opening day of our new church in Napa County, right there in the south part of Napa County. And that church went for about 3.5 years before at one point I felt like God was calling on me to do something different with my life. And that's when I chose to go into the police academy in San Francisco. I went to the police academy. I'd been going down there commuting every day, going to the academy, getting training to be a police officer. And as I was going down every day, every morning, I was listening to the radio, hearing preachers preach to me and being ministered to as I was doing that, praying to God. I had great conversation with the Lord every time I was driving down in the mornings. And I just remember as time was going by, God was pressing more on my heart. What are you doing here? And why are you doing this? And at some point, I couldn't refuse it anymore. And I had to go in, and I had to acknowledge to the captains and the lieutenants of the police department, and even to one of the top-level commanders, as I resigned from the academy. To all the people that were in the academy, I had to resign from it because the Lord was calling my heart to do ministry. So we ended up, after I resigned from the academy, 2 weeks, we packed our whole house up. We had no clue about, what was going to happen. We just knew that God was calling us to go down to Southern California, where I grew up in the San Bernardino area. And we came down. And I look back on that whole thing because the church only lasted maybe another 8 months, and then it closed its doors. And at times when you tried to explain this to people or you looked at it, some people would just think, what's wrong with you? What happened to you that you had a great church there and you just decided to walk away from it? What happened to you that you got in the police academy and you decided just to resign from it? What's wrong with you? And none of us likes to fail. The thing is, what I learned from that, I learned that I was called to do this. The second thing I learned from it is that my identity isn't defined by my successes and failures. That's the most important thing that we can learn from our failures, is that our identity is never defined by that. What is our identity defined by? It's defined by the Lord. He says in Psalm 139, verses 13 to 16, look at what God says about you. He said this to David. For you created my inmost being. That's what David's saying to the Lord. He says, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Our failures and successes don't define us. Our identity is found in the Lord. He says that He created us and we're fearfully and wonderfully made. And that's the most important thing to learn about when it comes to failure. When you go looking into the mirror and you hate what you've done, when you walk out of that meeting and maybe you've gotten written up at work, when you've had that fight at home or your kids have gotten in trouble at school, you remind yourself, yes, these are failures at times that we experience, but these things don't define me. God defines me. Another thing that we learn in how Jesus transforms our failures is that I rely on God. Coming all the way down to Southern California, all the different things I experienced in life up to this point, one of the things that really has taught me in failure is relying on God more and less on myself. We tend to rely on ourselves a lot. And the thing is about relying on the Lord is that God shows us, as Romans 8:28 says there, as we printed it for your text, that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Like Pastor Dane said, like you've heard us before, maybe you've heard it from other preachers, all things, it doesn't mean that all bad things, that they're somehow good. No, it means that in all things, God can work good. But that comes from us relying on Him, not trying to work the good ourselves. Relying on God does not mean I don't make plans, because Proverbs 16:9 talks about how we make our plans. But relying on God means just that. In my failures, if I'm relying on myself, I'm immediately discouraged, or we're immediately angry. But as we come out of that failure, we realize, God, I need to rely on you more. I need to trust you more with my life. And one of the great lessons we learn in failure is how we can rely on the Lord for his strength. Talks about an awful lot in the Bible how you and I have all these weaknesses, but God's strength is shown and is glorified because of him working through our lives. Another thing that we learn about how Jesus transforms our failures is that we can take the failure and grow more. Now, this is different than learn. Growing more, this is spiritually growing closer to the Lord. And sometimes that happens best when we bump our heads and we stub our toes. When I was coming home one late night doing some youth ministry in Oklahoma, I didn't have a place to live, so families would host me at their house. And I'm coming home one late night, and the door's wide open. I'm just walking up the walkway, and I hit their storm door head on. And it was just perfectly clear glass. See, in Missouri, Oklahoma, they have front doors, and then instead of screen doors, they actually have these storm doors that are on the front side. And so it was closed, and I hit it dead on. They thought a bird hit it, and I'm thinking, that must have been a big bird. That's like a pterodactyl flew into your house. And the thing is, I learned from that. I grew from it. It's like buttering toast while it's in the toaster. You learn not to do that as a kid. Sometimes we have to stub our toes, shock our thumbs, bump our heads for God to grow us. And God's not going to let you go through life and never let you bump your head. He's not going to let you go through life and never stub your toe, because through those things we grow spiritually. Paul mentions that in Romans 5, verse 3-4. He says, not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. He says failure, Paul's saying failure leads to change. Spiritual failure leads to spiritual change. It says it produces character. The imagery from that is not a rookie, but a veteran who is tempered through training. It leads to great change in our life when we have this spiritual failure. And the last thing that the Lord does for us in transforming our failures is that it can help me look for other doors. It can help me look for other doors. And that's exactly what the Lord did for us. As we came down and we were here and we were working and going about life, not knowing what God's plan was, and we were doing things for about a year and a half, we had started attending church here. And in that process, the Lord had opened another door for us to do ministry. Little did we know what God would do now that we're just about 6.5 years later. And how amazing it is that there's some doors that will close. Sometimes they're outside of our circumstances. We can't control it. Other times it comes from us. But the Lord has a way in the doors that close in our life, some of the failures we experience, of helping us look for other doors. Doors that are open elsewhere. And Proverbs 16:9 says that in our hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. Doesn't mean that God doesn't ever want us to make plans. It just means make your plans with prayer. Realize that your plans will go well if the Lord is involved. And get the Lord involved in your plans doesn't mean it's going to go exactly how you envision it, but it definitely means that your plans will be with the Lord. I got to tell you, one of the scariest things for me was a 45-minute ride to Kansas City, Missouri. I was on my way to interview for a church there to do youth ministry. And this 45-minute ride was with a man who would one day become my father-in-law. My father-in-law is a wonderful man, but the reason the ride was so scary is because for 45 minutes, I couldn't think of a way to ask him, can I marry your daughter? So then on the ride back, 45 minutes on the ride back to his house, I still couldn't think of a way, so I never asked him that day. I had to call later on the phone. But I was scared to death. I was scared that I was going to fail with my words. How do I ask a man if I can marry his daughter? I've never been taught that before. I was scared that he was going to reject me and tell me, no, you can't marry my daughter. You're from California. You're crazy. Everybody from there is crazy. But the thing is, I look back on it now, I have such a great relationship with my in-laws. They're like my parents. I love them to death. And I look back on it, it's kind of humorous to think that I was scared to ask my future father-in-law if I could marry his daughter. You know what's not humorous? It's how you fear going to God with your heart because you think your failures are so bad that the Father would never forgive you. What isn't humorous is how you look in the mirror and all you see is pain. Because you think, why would God ever love me? What isn't humorous is how you had a terrible relationship with your earthly father and how you look at the heavenly Father and you think he'll abandon you one day. But the thing is, we have a good Father who says, come with your failures. Come to me and lay them down, Jesus says, and I will give you rest. And how long all of us long for that rest. And if we have a Father like that, what's to fear? And Lord, I thank you for your love. I thank you for being a Father. And how we can come to you as children who are wandering, Lord, through life. As Jesus said, like sheep with no shepherd, no direction, carrying these bags of burden and pain and suffering. And Lord, we are coming to you. We are your children. And we are all these beggars knocking at your door, asking for your mercy, asking for your love. And I pray, Father, that you would reach down and that you would touch the hearts in here, Lord, who need to be encouraged by that. And thank you so much for the cross. Thank you that our failures are taken there and they are destroyed, not to surface again in our life. We praise you for that. And it's in your Son's name. Amen.